just in terms of I would say the broad scale of connections that we can make in this industry. What I have been really fortunate in it is in two parts. One is hosting this podcast has been a great outlet professionally for me because it's allowed me to develop by talking to other people. And I get really excited about the idea that I am able to broaden my knowledge base in terms of how experiential learning and adventure learning and other synonymous terms are being used. And then also, I get really excited about the connection between the organization which I serve on the board of, which is AEE. And that's partly the connection I believe I have to you is that you commented on a post of Vishwas Pachuri, who I have connected with over the years. He actually was just wrapping up the Asia Pacific AEE conference that happened over the last few days. And I saw your name and I must connect with Colin because I've seen your posts on LinkedIn. And this is another outlet for me to experience. And as you probably can hear, I am originally from England. I now live in the US. So my worldview sometimes is US centric. So the opportunity to talk with people who are teaching this stuff in the UK is really exciting for me. I'm going to ask a very broad question to start. What excites you at the moment about experiential learning?
Yeah, that is, I kind of knew you might ask me that. Maybe first, remind me if I get lost, but maybe first, one of the things I do is on my masterclasses, I say, look, if you're really going to let the learners do the learning, then why don't you start at the beginning where, when, for example, you often get students complaining that they're rather bored with all the lecturers introducing themselves, or people do death by introductions, around the circle and everybody starts to fall asleep. So I say, well, why don't you all get together in small groups and I'll allow each group to just ask me 2 questions. That way you're going to find out what you want to know instead of me telling you about me. And of course, what that does is get people to ask questions. But going back to where we've just started, I then say, but let me give you some advice first. If you ask boring questions, you're going to get boring answers. If you ask me interesting questions, you're going to get, and so on. Mm-hmm. So going back to your fascinating question, which I did think you'd ask me, what is it that excites me about experiential learning? Well, you kind of won't believe this, but there was something that happened to me when I went to the publishers in London, where I developed the world's first master's degree in outdoor management development. And I said, I want to publish a book. And they turned around to me and said, it's not going to sell, and I think you're wasting your time. Why don't you write a book on experiential learning? And actually, it was a turning point in my life where a publisher was saying, no, it's not going to happen. And then they suggested that I go away and write something on experiential learning, and that gave rise to a significant publication in 2002. And I think what's happened for me is I'm originally a zoologist, and I'm fascinated by nature and wildlife, the outdoors. I lived in the Amazon rainforest in the 70s, when the Brazilian embassy told me we couldn't go. I organized a big expedition. And my life has been fascinating. I've lived in the outdoors, managing nature reserves, working for the RSPB, protecting rare birds, and so on and so on and so on. And I think the outdoors has had a massive impact on me. And so everything started to come together in this kind of, why don't you write about experiential learning? And then I often whisper to the students in university that don't tell anybody, but I actually failed most of my A levels, and don't tell any other lecturers, but I actually have got a very poor degree. I got a 3rd class honours, and they're all enjoying this little kind of secret. But to be honest, I wasn't really somebody who was a scholar or an academic. But later in life, I've just become almost obsessed with this question of, what is experiential learning? Where does it come from? I could probably talk forever about experiential learning because I'm just almost obsessed with it, fascinated by it.
And I honestly find that those of us who find similarly, I think that most of us often find it. We're not seeking it. It's in a way, academically, as a perfect example, I was very much the same. I have been diagnosed as an adult of having ADHD, which confirms to me why academia in the public sense was just a challenge.
Yeah.
But I had a desire to find a way, an outlet for me that allowed me to help me learn. And the outdoors was similar to me. But then I found that, there's methodology behind this. There's studies. There is evidence to suggest this is a really positive way of learning. And yet we are still fighting the fight to try to encourage experiential learning to be great seen other than being pseudo educational.
Yes.
I do see, though, I've been working in this field for about 15 years. I'm seeing a shift in awareness, in the acceptance of it. And maybe it's due to things like COVID, where, the idea of being outdoors, social, emotional learning gets used as a buzzword often as well. And have you seen this shift as we move into this, maybe a new generation of educators, maybe some of the people you're teaching in school, in university? Are you seeing a greater acceptance or maybe a greater joy or passion towards where we're going?
Well, yeah, that's fascinating, because that turning point, the 2002 book and so on, and all that happened after that, and I think I might be the world's only professor of experiential learning, so I ought to know my stuff. And of course, that's a big that's a big responsibility.
A lot of responsibility, Colin.
Yeah. So I would say that in my invitations, I'm very lucky. I've done about 72, 73 keynotes around the world, and I get invited to work with people around the world on development programs, masterclasses, and so on and so on. And I am definitely seeing a new wave. It is growing. Experiential learning is growing. And for example, working with the Canadian International School in Singapore, there's a person there that was a lead for experiential learning. And then I start looking around, I see more people being designated in schools and universities as experiential learning specialists. So I think for me, I am seeing this new wave. I'm seeing now, if somebody comes and drags me off in the middle of this film, it's because somebody hasn't liked what I've just said. They probably come from America. But I think there's a fascinating thing been happening. When you look at the history, and I'm just about to produce another book, I think 10th, 11th book, especially for lecturers, on the history and the evolution of experiential learning and experiential education. But I think the history is fascinating. And of course, you have all these wonderful developments, but you read it behind the scenes that, women, black people, slaves should not be educated. So there's this shocking backcloth. There's been, if you like, the opposition out there that says, the very conservative opposition that says experiential learning is radical and progressive, or experiential education is. And so you've had these forces and counter forces going on in history, and that has been fascinating. And there is no doubt that David Kolb this is where I might get into trouble, but I'm going to say it because he has undoubtedly been responsible for the biggest spread of experiential learning around the world. We've got to give him credit. But when you start to do your research, you begin to find out that David actually worked in MIT in the business school, and I've been working for the last few years in a business school. And you begin to realize that what he was really doing and really interested in was the fact that managers didn't learn. They were so busy doing things that they weren't learning. They were in what we knew in the 80s was the activity trap, doing. And if you don't have time to think about what you're doing, you're not really going to maximize your learning. So what I'm saying is that he may have been extremely important in taking experiential learning to this new phase. But it could be that now the obsession with doing and thinking is actually responsible for a restrictive period of lack of growth and lack of diversity and lack of complexity and inclusivity, because even in universities, you see people saying we need to do more learning by doing. And then you say, well, doing what? And then they're stuck. Or they say active learning. And I say, what do you mean by active? Do you mean running around, being physically active? And so they get stuck again. So one of the things I'm doing in one chapter is to try and explain to people just what experiential learning is. And central to that terminology and experiential education is the word experience. And this is where the future lies, in understanding our experience of learning. Because if it's experiential, it has to focus on the experience of learning, and understanding the way we learn and how we learn is crucial to that. And we're in the experience economy. It makes sense. Everybody's talking about the experience, but nobody's asking the question, well, what is an experience? How do humans experience the world? So that's the exciting phase we're in now. Greater complexity, letting go of those, what I call the circles of the 60s. That's like, yeah, David Kolb's circle. They were commonplace in those days before David's publications. It was the plan, do, review. I'm sure you've probably heard of that. It was a common kind of approach, that kind of scientific approach to management, plan, do, review. So yeah, I think it's exciting. It's going through a new phase. Everybody's talking about it, and if you're not, you're missing out.
I am glowing with enthusiasm right now, and partly because myself and a colleague, we have been running workshops around the US, and also mentioning on the podcast that we are starting to have we call it the critical lens on core concepts. And the reason we're doing that is we are starting to actively challenge those things that we originally taught and saying, do they serve now? And one of them, of course, is the experiential learning cycle, as has been referenced. But in our industry as well, of adventure education, there's also this thing called challenge by choice, which we've been fighting against, created by Carl Ronke of Project Adventure. But once again, in the 70s. And so as we start to look at things, we don't want to disregard those things. But I think that classically what happens is as soon as a buzzword or a term comes into the vernacular, then it becomes the central thing that we focus on, and we ignore the greater work that people are doing. And in fact, I was having a really great discussion with some people I was training at a school a couple of days ago about this idea of comfort zones, another example of circular mindsets that we have: comfort, challenge, panic. And challenging what does comfort zone mean? Because our people are not coming into your space comfortable. So we have to realize we have to build on these concepts, and we can't just rely on them being the core central theme. Let's go into the experience of learning, because I love this reframe. It's starting to tweak stuff in my head around experiential learning, but the learning experience. Wow, that is I hope people are really listening to that as they're hearing this. That's a redefining factor for me as well.
Yeah.
How would you define the learning experience that we need to adapt? What components of a learning experience makes it more, let's say, experiential?
Yeah.
So it's even the right question.
Yeah. So the stuff that I'm trying to write at the moment, you would expect this because I'm a zoologist. So we need to look at our prehistory as well as our history to understand the way humans learn. So next week I'm speaking on the subject of space in India, and space is so important to our experience. So if you can imagine, every living creature tends to move, and you could almost say that if it's not moving, it's dead. And I know that's a bit crude, but we call living creatures animate. They move. And actually, movement in space is incredibly important. Spatial thinking is incredibly important. And, sharks have got bigger brains. Predatory sharks have got bigger brains than basking sharks. Well, why? Because they face challenges and they have to move and catch their prey, whereas those that basically just open their mouth and it's the same with gorillas and chimpanzees and so on and so on. And so kind of winding the clock back and looking at the things that were the major challenges to humans gives us some insight as to the things that are important. So we, about, I don't know, 5 million years ago, we really took advantage of the upright posture. We freed our hands. Our hands are incredibly important. I'm sure you're very aware of that. They allowed us to manipulate objects and so on in space again. Then we created tools, and this developed our spatial cognition. So you're probably getting the picture that movement, spatial understanding, spatial awareness, and the ability to do advanced thinking, social interaction. So unfortunately, when humans got so clever, our brains became so complex that our babies took so long to develop. So we had to develop social groupings to protect ourselves. And so suddenly you begin to see, as you wind all this forward to today, that same wiring in your head and my head is being upgraded to if you like, a present day experience, but all that original wiring is still there. And if you look at, there's some fabulous quotes about what are the major areas of the brain, and they're what you'd expect: language, movement, spatial cognition, and so on and so on and so on. So this is not particularly helpful for people who want something to replace the simple circle models. So this is what I'm saying is, I often put a rope on the floor and I say, this is a human being. Let's have a look. And, what is, first of all, what is it that we see? And we see inside the rope is your internal world, and that's you in your inside. And then outside is the world out there. So suddenly we've got three things: the skin, the surface, where all our sensory systems operate, or most of the systems that join the two worlds. And as I walk through all of this and help people to learn, notice by walking, by talking, by social interaction, by seeing the space in front of me, all those original things that humans developed are at play. And people just get it straight away because they've walked it, because they've talked it, because they can see it, they can see the spatial awareness. And I ask them to walk in and out of it, of the model. So to sum it up, this is what I think learning is all about. It's about sensing. We often fail to recognize that those senses are so important to people. There is no world without the senses. That information that goes into ourselves goes through the senses and straight to the emotional systems. It then goes by the slow route. I'm sure you probably heard of fast thinking, slow thinking by the Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman. It then goes to the brain. So you've got sensing, feeling, thinking. But is that it? Are we just sensing, thinking, feeling bodies? No, we are human beings. So then we talk about being. So then we've got another one: sensing, feeling, thinking, being. So let's pop out to the outside world around us, because there's a big world out there. So what happens in that world? Well, there's loads of other human beings, and we have a deep need to belong, as we found out during COVID. So we've got belonging in the human world, but we've also, and I would say this because and you would say this because you love the outdoors, there's a bigger world out there, a world of living things and mountains and whatever, but there's also classrooms. So there's a kind of a physical and a living world. So that's what we call the more than human world. And of course we do things. So back to the David Kolb doing and think and reflecting, we do things. So how many have you got now? You've probably got about 7 major capabilities of every human to learn. We sense, we feel, we think, we do, we belong in many different ways, and put all those together, and that's who we are. That's our being. That's our identity. If you want a big academic word, they talk about the ontological perspective. Anyway, that's us. Now, walking it with the rope is fantastic because people just get it straight away. And I know they've got it because I actually do a little test with them. But if you did that, by telling people like I've just done with you, it's actually very hard to imagine. And I would love if you would give me just a few minutes to explain this word imagination. You go into the Harry Potter studios in London, and there's a wonderful poster we were talking about this, you and I, before we went on air. this poster was written by a choreographer. We talked about choreography, and he said, what starts off as words on a page become the imagination that we conjure up. Imagine if you read the book and I read the book, and we both then had a conversation, or we had to draw Hagrid or Professor Dumbledore. And this is one of the problems with teaching in schools. The kids have to imagine what the teacher's saying. And of course, you then get errors of imagination. Because, and that's proved, because if you and I went to see the film, I bet you afterwards we'd say, I don't know, but I didn't imagine Dumbledore like that, or I didn't imagine that Hagrid would be like that. It was fantastic. Yeah. So these errors of imagination all point to the fact that we need experiential learning, not traditional classroom learning. There's a wonderful book called Teaching with Your Mouth Shut. I wouldn't suggest that, because saying nothing wouldn't make you a good teacher. And then, of course, there's the famous, students call it, death by PowerPoint. So yeah, the errors of imagination, written by a choreographer, and the poster in the Harry Potter studios. It sticks in my mind.
Oh, and I think what it probably is ties down to, in a larger sense in this world, is the misinterpretation often of texts and others that lead to conversation,
yes.
Splits of opinions, separation between parties. Like, we can go deep in terms of like how it influences when we allow our imaginations to run wild, as an example. Let's go, because I'm intrigued by this. How do we? I'm going to tie into you. I understand you're in the academic world, so it's almost hard to. But you come from a place of not, as you highlighted at the start, not necessarily being academic. How when we come to access or introduction into the industry, like we have, I think there's an importance that we have the academia. We have the Journal for Experiential Education, comes up with a lot of academic texts, which are really formative in demonstrating the power. My concern, though, is that the academia, even as you reference some of the academic language, can create an access issue between newer people coming into the field, because it creates that barrier sense. How do we merge that gap between the importance of the academia, but also knowing that we want to make it we don't want to dumb it down, but we want to make it so that people understand it. Is it through what you're suggesting, maybe having those opportunities to do physical experiences rather than just reading? It's almost like, how do we experientially learn experiential learning? Wow, it's dream within a dream.
Yeah.
How do we do that? What's that gap?
Yeah, fascinating. I think one of the things that we have to realize is that if you can imagine all the disciplines, we've got science, we've got arts, we've got physics, we've got chemistry, we've got biology, we've got, and of course you go on to university and you study all sorts of things, and the range is quite considerable, but they all have their own tribal language. That language develops so much that it becomes unaccessible, to the point where, even as a professor, I've got 2 books downstairs that I bought, and I get through the first 2 or 3 pages, and I always find the first 2 or 3 pages are exciting, and after that I just don't understand what these people are talking about. So I think to myself, am I stupid? Well, I don't think I am. And I know that, despite your comment about ADHD, you're pretty bright. I know, I can tell straight away. But what I think I'm saying is that it takes a long time to understand this tribal language, and it is like you're surrounded by a different tribe and you don't really understand what they're talking about. And the problem is, we've got so many different tribes, we've got so many different languages. But there's talk, fascinating talk, about universities of the future possibly being much more multidisciplinary, where we actually study life problems from a multidisciplinary perspective, because it's only by being multidisciplinary that we can perhaps solve some of the big complex problems. Now, I find that quite exciting because, as I say, I'm a zoologist, but I've also studied lots of other disciplines. But I'm frustrated by the fact that people in many parts of the world think that experiential learning and experiential education are all about the outdoors, and they're all about doing things out there, or they may be about field trips or chemistry laboratories or whatever, not teaching. But this is changing, and I think experiential learning is beginning to flow through. Hence, why am I writing a book right now that's just really for higher education lecturers around the world on experiential learning and experiential education, but more importantly, design. Now, that keyword design, lots of books are beginning to emerge, and I'm seeing courses emerge in Hong Kong, in China, in Singapore, and India, and the word design is now being used a lot. We're teaching people how to design. Now, that too is a good sign, because if you're going to let the learners do the learning, which is the strapline that I use, the first strapline, let the learners do the learning, then really and truly you've got to step back, and you've got to say that I'm going to try and teach with my mouth shut most of the time, which means I've got to ask myself the question, how on earth am I going to do that? And the answer is, you've got to design experiences that will help people to grasp and understand something by themselves, taking responsibility and experiencing things that will get them to think, to get them to use their senses, to get them to do all of those things that I mentioned earlier on, those 7 capacities, and arrive at some fascinating conclusions that may not always be where you thought they would end up. So it's a bit scary in some ways for a lot of teachers, because they're not going to hide behind telling facts and showing PowerPoint slides. But it's happening. But it's a big leap between the outdoors and the indoor classroom. I notice, AAE means experiential education. What's the difference between education and learning, for example, is a big question, a difficult one for some people. We need to get kids outdoor more. We need to address some of the mental health issues that we're facing in today's society. And we know that probably nature and the outdoors is one of the best therapists that we all have access to, but it needs more push, more money, more resources to get kids out there and experience the world out there. Yeah.
Let me ask this. It's a kind of tangential kind of thought that I'm having. Is I had this conversation with Common Connection Vishwas Paturi about the art of facilitation, let's say, and he said that facilitation cannot be taught, and I really enjoyed his perspective on this, and so I ask you similarly, when in your research we talk about the different components of a learning experience. We've got the students, we've got the space, we've got the design of the program. The one thing I think that I was originally taught that the aim was to try to, as we said, talk less, but almost say that I'm there just to facilitate. I'm not there to be necessarily a component part of the experience, but yet we have experienced, probably you have experienced this, teachers or professors that have, just by their charisma, their personality, them as who they are, they have made the learning experience so much greater. What role does the actual educator have in the learning experience, and can it be taught?
Yeah, I know where Vish is coming from. I think a lot of things can't be taught, and in fact, I think if I'm right, I think it was Carl Rogers that once said, anything that's worth understanding can't be taught in some ways. Yeah, I think this business of standing back, and your question then is, so what is your role? Sometimes I'll write down, we're experiential guides, because actually we're just letting the experience happen, because we've spent so long designing it. We can literally walk out the room and sometimes people won't know we've gone. But sometimes when we come back, there are some questions that, participants want to ask you. And so I think it's important that you can help them to answer those questions, that you have a depth and a richness in your experience of life to say, have you thought about this, and what about this? Or let me tell you a story, or let me ask you this key question. Going back to when I said about introductions, just that little input about, if you ask me, you can argue this is front loading, just by saying, if you ask me boring questions, you're going to get boring answers. it influences the mind. And I think good teachers really enjoy, if you like, exploring territory, exploring subjects, topics. And I think some of the best ones do have a lot of experience. Students sometimes say to me, and I would say I am not just a professor in a university. In fact, I've just retired. I am still traveling around the world running masterclasses and doing this and doing that, doing live performances sometimes in front of people, which is pretty scary. But this thing, what I call live crafting. But students will often say to me, how come you know so much? And I say to them, how old are you? And they'll say, I'm 19. I say, well, I'm 71. You know, when you get to 71, yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I remember when I first started, and in my early 20s, I was asking similarly of people who were older than me, when I watch you, you're able to tell so many stories, where they said they've experienced more things, so they have more stories to tell.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've gotten to a stage now where I do have more stories to tell. I don't have some of the breadth, but I still have more stories, and I find that informs my ability to step away.
Yeah.
And so it's that in itself is interesting from the educational perspective, that almost the industry requires, and I'm sure that's a case of all educational fields, but the industry requires us to ourselves gain experience as an educator before we can effectively teach the
Yeah.
topics that we're trying to teach, which I always find is like a hard thing to tell new students coming in, and they're like,
Yeah.
how do we get to where you are, Phil? Okay, great question. Well, you do the 20 years that I've just done.
Yep.
Like
Yeah.
that's that hard balance.
Yeah.
So maybe this will wrap this, but maybe what would be your actionable advice to newer educators who are entering this field, who are excited about the topic, excited about the opportunity, but want to increase their capacity for teaching? What is something that you would recommend they do? And maybe it's
Yeah.
reading more, studying more, but what would be your advice to them?
Yeah. I think it's fascinating that teachers and educators and facilitators, I don't know, you may have come across something called geometric psychology, where you get to choose between shapes, circle, a triangle, square, squiggly line, and so on. And when I've worked with accountants, like KPMG or whatever, I know that the vast majority will pick the square, because in their world, everything has to be yes or no, in the box or not. It's legal or it's not legal. And you can do it or you can't. And they're a certain kind of people, and they're very, there's a lot of controversy over this, but they're very left-brain focused. So when I come to do trainers and facilitators and work with them and do that same activity, I say, well, I want all those people that really your first choice would be a circle to go over there. And I always leave the small spaces at the back of the room for the squares and the triangles. And sometimes I'll say, well, that's interesting because the square tribe has become extinct. There's nobody there. And then everybody's packed into this big space at the front because they're all circles or squiggly lines. So I think when you listen to the conversations that they all have, well, why do you like the circle, and what does it tell you about the way you like to learn? And you begin to hear things like, well, we like it because it's rounded. There's no points. And those conversations are fascinating. I think a lot of trainers and facilitators, the kind of shadow side is we all like to be liked. We all like to be loved. In fact, everybody does really, but I think probably more so with teachers and educators. But I think we all have a passion for helping people. And it might be that people like you and me, which we've already discussed, have had our struggles in life with learning. And to me, it's a tragedy when I see people struggling and they don't need to. It's not as difficult as they think it is. And I've had to work hard. And I want to say, look, why don't you try this? Because this is a good way of trying to get to grips with this. And I think if you can remember all the time why you're doing it, and you can find that passion and the spring in your step that says, I want to get up in the morning. I love getting up in the morning. There's a lot to do. I think you can do an awful lot to help society. But I also think I remember the times when people were always raving on about continuous improvement. I forget, there was a name, a Japanese Kaizen, I think, continuous improvement. Now I have an obsession with continuous improvement because I love it. And so, just give you a simple example. I'll run a masterclass somewhere around the world, and I go back to a hotel at night, and I just think, oh, that's fascinating. Oh, I've just had an idea. I've got to write this down. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with that same thing. I've got it. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll say to my wife, I've just had an amazing idea. And she'll sort of look at me as if to say, shut up and go to sleep. and that thing about wanting to make it better, wanting to make it more impactful, wanting to make it more enjoyable. I watch Fish, and he says, facilitation can't be taught. To be honest, you only have to watch him for an hour, and you'll learn a lot. And he's kind of teaching you by just being there, being himself, and those piercing blue eyes that he's got. He asks you questions sometimes, and it just hits you. It just, whoa. Run that past me again.
I don't think anyone I've spoken to has challenged me more, just in a sharp 2 sentences.
Yep. Yeah.
than Vish was.
Yeah.
I love the idea. You're really leading us in this mindset of like, if lead with your passion and really start to try to learn and grow, and there has to be. You can't just have it given to you. You have to strive, and you have to work, and you have to ask the questions. You have to look it up. I remember when I was starting, I would email as many people as I had books, so I'd email the authors and just ask them for some advice. And so I encourage people who are listening to this to do the same. Like I've mentioned it so many times in episodes, please reach out with questions. Like I am an open resource to support the growth and the learning, and I have many connections to help you find careers. And so I encourage people to do it. And likewise, I will stick your contact information, Colin, if that's okay, in the description of this, and people can reach out if they have questions. I feel like that desire to grow and learn, I think that I feed off of that in the same way that, when I talk to people, I have no assumptions that I know everything or all things. And so when people tell me stuff, I'm like, ooh, that's exciting. I can't wait to look that up because I've never heard of that before.
Yeah. Isn't it funny how we started with questions, and the art of getting people to ask questions in what might appear to be quite innocuous introductions, like, well, why don't you ask me questions? And here we are finishing with, we really are recommending people to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't be afraid to get a bit deep and say, well, yes, but, and what about, and fascinating. Yeah. Full circle.
Absolutely. There was a phrase that I've been using recently, and I heard this, and I can't attribute it. I'm blanking on where it's from, but they said the critic is the greatest optimist. And I really enjoy the phrasing of that, because rather than critics being seen negatively, you're an optimist because you're wanting to see where it can go next and how it can improve. So I look at things critically, not with an air to disregard them, but how can we get them better? So the critic is the greatest optimist.
Yes, lovely.
Thank you so much, Colin. This has been a real treat. I encourage people to check out stuff, and I will hope that this connection continues for years to come. And I'm going to stop us right there.